People like to say, have a good day, and it's a nice sentiment, but it's a fixed perspective that can put a lot of pressure on us. It's also really hard to define from person to person. What about instead if we ask ourselves, how can I have a better day? At work, at home, in life? That's what this show is all about. The Have a Better Day podcast comes to you from Boon, a personalized coaching platform that helps businesses everywhere to support the whole humans, which are their employees. We have our pulse on what employees are dealing with in today's workplace, and we want to share those insights with you. Welcome to the Have a Better Day podcast. Very lucky to be here today with Keith Cocking, talking about embracing failure as a catalyst for growth and leadership development in the workplace. Keith is he's a Georgia Bulldogs fan, which we have a friendly rivalry, as I am a Michigan Wolverine, and his Bulldogs gave me the worst college football experience of my lifetime, which was the Orange Bowl back in 2021, 2022. I don't know. It's all COVID was all a blur, but anyways, really excited to talk about this really important topic in today's workplace around embracing failure. I think it doesn't get talked about enough, and there is a huge generational shift that we're seeing as to what this means in today's workplace, what this means in society overall. And I'm excited to dive into it with you further, Keith. So looking forward to chatting with you. All right. Well, welcome to the podcast, Keith. We are so glad to have you, and thanks everybody for joining today. We are really lucky to have Keith Cocking here, who is a L&D leader and current Boon coach. Keith has more than 25 years of background in L&D leadership experience at companies like Home Depot, UPS, Delta, B of A, and Coca-Cola. So he's been around the Fortune 100, Fortune 500 space for a long time, and we feel really lucky to have him as a Boon coach today, and feel really lucky to be talking about this topic around embracing failure in greater detail. So Keith, thank you so much for being here. Maybe just kicking it off with just sharing a little bit about your journey and leadership development and just really how your experiences have shaped how you embrace failure today.
Oh my goodness, that's quite the question there. Well, I guess a little bit about myself. I've in any role I've had, there tend to be three elements that have always existed. That's some element of leadership, some element of learning, the learning being either building training or facilitating training, and then also coaching as well. And as you heard, I've worked with a lot of different organizations. And as far as what I've noticed with failure is really all about striving for success, for striving to be your best self. And I've noticed different relationships that leaders have with failure throughout as they're striving to be their best selves. Those who have a great relationship with failure, who in other words understand this is just part of how we as adults learn and are curious about their failures, they tend to have a growth curve that looks like this. It goes up really quickly, right? And those who fear the failure, who instead internalize the failure of, I failed, therefore I am a failure, They tend to have a lot of shame, just a lot of bad feelings as well. And their growth curve, they're still growing, but it doesn't grow as much. It looks a little bit more flat. What I've learned in my own life is that this is a learned skill as well. And that in learning how to strive for greatness, you learn how to better handle failure, which means you can take this growth curve like this and make it go more like this.
Yeah. And I guess talking a little bit about your evolution into becoming a coach as well, Keith, is like, how has this played a role at all in you becoming a coach? Obviously you have the L&D experience, so naturally you're in this learning and development realm. How did this topic play a role in you ultimately becoming a coach more formally?
Yeah, I'm 53 and I was in coaching. Thank you for laughing at my age. I appreciate that.
Honestly, I thought I was talking to a 29-year-old.
Oh, okay. There we go. Yeah. And I came into coaching a little bit later. It was something I was always really passionate about. And I think as I learned to grow with failure more, because becoming a coach, there's a lot of learning you've got to go through. I'm an ICF certified coach. And there's a lot of learning and training you got to go through, which means there's a lot of bumps in the road and a lot of failure. And I think in the past, I was probably a little bit more risk averse. And through this
Yeah.
process and learning how to really strive for greatness and accept failure as part of the process, here I am today.
And, I think when we talk about our own experiences with failure, I mean, I'm an entrepreneur. I started Boone almost 5 years ago, and you're basically kind of staring failure into the face every single day as an entrepreneur. So there's something that doesn't go right, whether it's a conversation with a customer, it's we made a bad hire. There are a million things that go wrong, and I think a lot of the things you're talking about around just internalizing and feeling that shame of like, oh, well, that means I'm not good enough. It's taken a lot of just internal reflection to start to just really just improve the overall relationship that I have with failure and what that looks like. But like receiving critical feedback, so many of these things, they're so difficult in the moment. And it's like, how can you get grounded and try to reframe some of these conversations? And, I was a big athlete and still am to a certain extent, not as much with two babies at home, but, losing in sports when I was competing at a high level, and just so many different experiences of failing in different ways throughout my life. And I kind of look back at that now. You may not appreciate it in the moment as growth gifts, but ultimately, there's no doubt that they've made me much stronger into who I am today. But maybe just tell me a little bit more about your experience with failure personally in your life. And I guess just would love to hear more about that journey for you.
Yeah, you mentioned athletics. My father was a professional soccer player, came over from England in the 60s to play pro soccer. My brother, who's older than me, played at Division I All-American or Division I school here in college and was brilliant as well. I was not. I struggled with it. I had fun with it, but I struggled with it as well. And I adopted the mindset that it was I didn't know what it was called at the time, but I learned through a great book called Mindset by Dr. Carol Dweck that I had a very fixed mindset, which was, I believe that you're born with it or you're not. I saw my brother, my father, who had all these great athletic gifts, and I didn't get the same ones, but I also missed all the hard work they were doing behind the scenes as well, And I just had the mindset, you're born with it or you're not. And that mindset morphed a little bit from you're born with it or you're not to if it's hard, then you're not born with it. Which means I was very risk averse and failure averse as well, because that to me was evidence that I wasn't good at whatever it was. It should have been easy in my mind. So when I got promoted into leadership, I was making mistakes left and right, which is a natural function of whenever you're doing something new. But instead of just learning with it and saying, okay, I'm growing and learning and giving myself grace, I would look at myself and have these really hard conversations. You're not cut out for this, Keith. And I had, through a lot of mistakes and a lot of failure, though, and through beginning to strive and try for a lot more things. And I had a few things happen in my life where I changed that relationship with failure. And now I'm a lot better with it. And I have more of a growth mindset, which is I believe that I can grow and learn in almost anything. I may not be an Olympic athlete. I'm not saying that, but I can certainly grow and learn and improve wherever I was. I don't think it's you're born with it or not. And I think it's more organic than that.
Yeah, I think that fixed versus open mindset is huge. And I think just for the Brits who are listening to this podcast, they may be frowning at your reference to soccer coming from England. I think we may have to reframe as football in the Cocking household.
Yes.
But I guess I'm curious as it related to that fixed mindset, because I think so much of my childhood where some of these things did come a little bit easier to me. And I almost had the opposite approach where it was like, okay, certain things were coming easier to me, but then I was almost feeling like I needed to really work extra hard to get to that next level. But because things came easy to me, I was not putting in that extra work. So it was almost this like opposite psychology in certain instances. And then I would fail and it would be like, oh, but you're not willing to work hard enough to get there. So you are a failure. So, whether you're not good enough, or you're not going to work hard enough, or you're not talented enough. Like there's always going to be a story that your ego is playing in your head, no matter what the situation is. So it's just funny kind of thinking about the dichotomy there.
Yeah, you mentioned ego. One of the things that helped me was Brazilian jiu-jitsu. I would get out on the mats and really struggle with it, but I kept at it. And I remember getting promoted and getting my blue belt, which was a really big moment for me. And then I started to go to some of the more advanced classes. And my drive home, you want to talk about ego. It punished me on the way home, and it just kept telling me, why are you doing this, Keith? You're a fraud. You shouldn't be out on the mat. You're an imposter. You're an old man doing a young man's game, and you never were athletic in the first place. And these people just make it look so effortless. And I read this book. The author's name was Chris Matakis. It was all about jiu-jitsu, and he said that ego is a defense of an illusion for something that is not real.
Yeah.
And that was like, whoa, that hit me pretty hard. And so I started putting my ego aside, and it helped me get better a lot.
It's huge. And, I think coming back into the workplace a little bit, Keith, and just thinking about, you've been working with a few different generations of employees now in the workplace, and Boone's primary target market, 80% of our users that are working with our coaching services today are between the ages of 18 to 44. So heavy population of millennial and Gen Z.
Yeah.
I think I've noticed a really big shift as it relates generationally to how different generations embrace failure and think about failure as a society. I don't know if you're familiar with the book by Jonathan Haidt that just came out recently called The Anxious Generation, talking about the idea of these helicopter parents and this idea of trying to remove as much adversity as possible from their childhood for their kids, and how that is actually corresponding to a lot of the mental health challenges that we're seeing in society with this younger generation today. So it feels like there's been a huge shift in like trying to remove as much failure and adversity in society today. And there are a lot of arguments out there that's kind of correlating into a lot of the data around some of these increases in mental health challenges. So what is your view on just some of the generational shifts that are taking place today? Is this something you're seeing in the workplace?
I don't know if I see it in the workplace. I'm sure it's present there in some way, shape, or form. I see it with my son and his friends. He's 9. Yeah, I know. I've been called his grandfather quite a few times. He's playing football right now, and it's astounding to me going out there. And I don't know if this is unique to this generation, but something that I see is that the parents will be so harsh on their kids. It's like we're creating shame factories just for these kids where they're striving for excellence and just going out and having fun in a sport. And these parents can hover around so much and don't do that. You're doing this wrong. And it's almost like we're teaching them, hey, when you're trying something new or learning a new skill, you should be absolutely furious at yourself.
Right.
Because some of these parents, and I've been there too, as has my wife, we can get frustrated watching our son perform. And he's trying his best.
Right.
These parents just can get so mad. And I think the kids soak this in to where it's, all right, so if I'm really striving for greatness then, and it's not going so well, I should get really stressed, versus encouraging that, hey, this is part of it. It's amazing going to try to be yourself. It's also really hard, and failure is a part of it. And what'd you learn from it, versus how dare you not be perfect?
100%. Yeah, it's setting that expectation for perfection at such a young age. And part of me just wonders, there was this article that just came out from the Wall Street Journal talking about how the 20 and 30-year-olds in the workplace, they're kind of looking for more meaning, more support, more overall growth in the workplace, which in certain ways I think is great. And, I'm a little bit biased, but I feel like the overall employee growth infrastructure for most organizations is completely broken. However, I also feel like there's a big element of this constant need for validation with some of the younger generation that might be stemming from some of what you're talking about, where it's like, if you do have such an intense focus around being perfect at something at all moments, and you are getting this just overemphasis, intense feedback loop on such a consistent occasion, then, what are you going to do when you're not getting that feedback? You've all of a sudden become accustomed to that
Yeah.
your entire childhood. And then what does that leave you for the workplace?
Yeah.
So it's really interesting to see the way that's evolving. I'm really curious, as you see that impact, Keith, I'd be curious just, as you think about the next 10 to 15 years, like, how do you see that trend evolving in the long-term future of our leaders and just future of the workplace more broadly?
I know when I'm coaching clients and I'm also facilitating leadership classes, there's a lot of resonance, no matter what age, around failure. Yeah. And I think it's important that we talk about it and identify what our personal relationship is with failure and how, because it's connected to us striving and really putting ourselves out there, which is a very vulnerable thing to do when we're striving and putting ourselves out there. And it's part of the process. And when it comes up with clients or when it comes up in class, you can feel the vulnerability in the room. Everyone's just kind of like, yeah, this is a real thing. And it's important for us to know how we treat ourselves and what we tell ourselves in those moments. So it's certainly present in my generation, and I could certainly see in future generations how it's also turning up as well.
Yeah. And, I was just talking to a friend who he had received a piece of critical feedback from within his organization, extremely high functioning professional in today's workplace, leader at call it a Fortune 500 business, and has done exceptionally well, received a critical piece of feedback. And he was basically telling me, like, I haven't slept for the last 4 days because I've just been thinking about this feedback. And, how do I rectify this? Is this even real? How do I think through this? So I think even like normalizing this idea at a higher level around like, hey, and setting that expectation of, hey, we're here to help you grow personally and professionally. Here are all the amazing things that we're seeing you do. Here's an opportunity for something to work on. So even, the boss who happened to be, one of the leaders of this Fortune 500 organization, he wasn't even potentially skilled in delivering that feedback, which is kind of shocking to hear that in a lot of instances, that is the case in organizations today, is just how to deliver, how to receive feedback, basic leadership management skills that are kind of driving this emotional attachment or relationship with failure ultimately. So it's really interesting to see that evolve. And I guess just question for you, Keith, like as you're coaching and as a leader in the workplace, like what are some practical tips that you typically recommend for somebody looking to improve their overall relationship with failure?
Great question. I think one of them is to be very intentional when you're pushing yourself and trying something new, where you're really kind of out there and like, oh, this is a little scary. That feeling where you get butterflies and goosebumps, the butterflies from the excitement of trying something new and the goosebumps of there's a lot of eyes on me or a lot of pressure here. Pay attention to what you tell yourself. And what I'd recommend you do is over many periods of time, write it down or type it up. Log it, what it is. Not only what you tell yourself, but also what specific feelings do you have? Do your shoulders get tight? Is there a certain feeling you get in your chest or in your stomach? And what are the emotions that are present as well? The more you do that, the more you'll notice the patterns. And the more you notice the patterns, the more familiar you get with it. And then if it tends to be very negative and you have a pattern of negative self-talk, when you recognize that voice and those feelings, it doesn't have as much of a hold on you. It almost becomes like, oh, well, that's like Aunt Sally. She's coming to talk to me right now. Or, oh, here's those feelings of fear because I'm striving for excellence right now. That's one of the things, is just recognizing those patterns. The other thing is just giving yourself grace to realize that you are striving and putting yourself out there. And grace is a wonderful gift when you're doing that.
Yeah. And I think like, I'm just trying to, as you're talking about this, I'm trying to like apply this to my own day to day. And I think like some tendencies that I know I have, and I think this is the other part of it, is like, I hate these tendencies. Like I'm so aware of them that I hate them.
What is it?
And I think, well, one of them is I can be passive aggressive, which like I absolutely hate, like when I start to shut down, I shut down and I become passive aggressive. Those are like my
Okay.
two things, and they kind of go hand in hand. So like if I feel like I'm failing in something, not doing a good enough job, I feel like I've received some really critical feedback on something that I personally put a lot of investment in, whatever it is. I feel like that can be my go-to. And like I feel it so intensely, but even in that moment, it's so like it's one thing to say, you know, see what you're feeling and give yourself grace. How do you come out of that?
That's a great point. Having a plan for it is helpful. When you know what those patterns are and you see what it is. I'll tell you one thing that me and one client worked on. He was a new C-suite executive in a new organization, or new to him, that didn't hire from the outside a lot. And when you said shutting down, he would shut down a lot in meetings. And he almost said he felt like he just kind of went blank. And I almost pictured like this kind of empty smile. And he just completely shut down and go blank for a while. So what we did is he went through the pattern of identifying like what happens when he's in this process. And he'd identify, well, I shut down. I feel not very in touch with the best parts of me. And I don't feel like I have my words with me, et cetera. And so we tried out different personas. Well, what are some different options of how you could approach this? And he came out with 3 or 4, and he'd try them in different meetings to where with enough practice, he was able to overcome it. And it was also the recognizing, it was the practice with the different personas, and then just the recognition of, okay, here's that voice again.
Yeah. So I think it's things like that. And I guess the real-time stories are always super helpful. And I think maybe just talking a little bit more about just stepping back from a coaching lens and maybe just giving the audience a little bit more background and like holistically, as a coach, Keith, how can they work with employees through these types of challenges? And what does that relationship look and feel like more broadly?
This is what coaches are here for. This is what I think coaches can really help people with it. No matter what coaching school any coach goes to, one of the main tenets of it is curiosity. And when the client is in pure judgment mode of saying, oh my gosh, I'm not being perfect. How come I'm not learning this faster? Or I should be up here, but they're here. We're not judging them. We're curious with them and just helping them explore it. That key skill of curiosity is one of the foundations that helps you help the client get out of this space and continue to strive for greatness and kind of stop listening to the voice. And it teaches the client the skill of curiosity as well.
Yeah. And I think curiosity is such a big part of this. And I think that kind of dovetails nicely into our next topic, which is really just around, I think, you touched on it a little bit, but this idea of being able to really shift that mindset when you are in those moments, and like what mindset shifts are necessary to embrace failure, and how do you move from that? It's essentially moving from a fixed mindset to a curious mindset in those moments where you are shut down. So like, how can you get to that point of giving yourself grace? Obviously it's going to take practice, but how can you get to that point? Is it as simple as just getting your kind of routine together and kind of just really ironing that out time and time again? Or what is it?
It's a lot of practice. It's a lot of reflection. It's also understanding how we as human beings learn. I don't know if you ever saw the movie The Matrix. Did you see that movie back in the day?
Of course. I mean,
okay.
Keanu Reeves.
What's that?
Keanu Reeves.
There you go. Yeah, Neo.
Yeah.
There's a scene where the main character, he lives like in a computer generated world. Yeah. So if he wants to learn something new, his folks who are at the computer can just load the software into him and he learns it just like that. And so at one point in the movie, he needs to learn Kung Fu. So he communicates to his folks, hey, I need to learn Kung Fu. They teach him Kung Fu just by loading software, and he has it like that. And suddenly he's a black belt. That's not how we learn. But that's the expectation we will put on ourselves often when we are learning. How we learn is through trial and error. Think about how a kid, when they learn to walk, It's one step in front of the other, and then they fall a lot. And then they get back up and what if I turn my foot a little bit this way or a little bit this way? They learn to walk eventually through a lot of trial and error and a lot of failure. And we, as you don't see the kids going, boy, I wish I were faster than Jonathan down the street. I'm not walking as fast as him. They're not judging themselves. No, they're curious and excited by the moment. And we as parents, when you see videos of kids like learning how to walk, you don't see kids or parents going, you should be faster. Why aren't you doing this better? There's that curiosity there. And there's just an understanding of how we learn. It's trial and error. It takes a lot of effort and a lot of repetition. Whether you're learning a leadership skill, and leadership is just a function of interpersonal skills, right? If you're focusing on one specific leadership skill, it's going to take that repetition and a lot of practice.
Yeah. And I think something that has become more and more apparent to me in the workplace specifically is just, Home Depot and Fortune 100 businesses that you've worked at are kind of another animal in terms of, okay, we have core competencies, we have leadership and development frameworks, we have XYZ in terms of skills and development areas that employees need to grow in order to get to the next level. And a new manager, you need to learn how to delegate, you need to learn how to deliver feedback, receive feedback, all of these things. 99% of companies don't have any of that infrastructure in place. They might have core values in place, they might have a mission and vision, but in terms of like, hey, we just brought on 50 new managers and we don't actually have clear expectations on what skills they need to be building in their new role. So I think part of this conversation is like, okay, well, if those clear expectations are not in place, I mean, the repetition is going to have to happen. But as part of this, it's also a conversation to me around like, how can we build some of this infrastructure around it's okay to fail early on.
Yeah.
And it's actually expected for these managers. And then also just kind of weaving that into the overall framework of what you're building as an organization. So interesting to see the way that's happened.
I'd love to ask you a question because you're the leader of Boone Health. When you look at failure in the organization, and there's a lot happening at Boone Health right now, how do you establish the culture of failure and success at Boone Health?
It's an interesting question. I feel like the biggest thing that we've tried to incorporate is, and I think this is difficult because we're a remote team, and I think a lot of this does come down to communication. Right. And it's more difficult than ever to communicate virtually when you have team members all over the country, and in our case, all over the world. I think the biggest thing has been setting up consistent one-on-ones to be talking through, really just like, how are we setting expectations? How are we doing with those expectations? And really setting the expectation up front that like, hey, we're here to, like, we're your biggest fan and we're here to see you grow personally and professionally. There are going to be moments where things maybe weren't done the way you would have wanted them to, we would have wanted them to, and that's going to happen. We're not going to hit our revenue goal for the month. We might make a couple bad hires. We may do XYZ that's not going to work out, but ultimately we're going to fail fast and we're going to learn from it. And we have a culture where we're going to communicate where those things are happening. So I think just keeping that open line of communication where, and I think another thing that, like, as a CEO, I try to be vulnerable and authentic as much as I can, because I think having that from the top is a really important function in all of this. Like, it can't just be lip service. And so I think just really setting those expectations that, like, you are here to support those people. And ultimately, like, when we're delivering that sort of value to our customers, that's our biggest pitch is like, hey, as a business, you are telling your people, we're here to invest in you personally and professionally. Ultimately, this all does, in a way, come back to, like, how can we get our people to better have a relationship with failure and grow faster, right? Like, this is all about employees growing in the workplace. A lot of this is coming down to how can we get them to have a positive relationship with failure and ultimately become more resilient. So those are just a few ideas.
Brilliant. Makes me think of this video I saw of another really quickly moving company is SpaceX. SpaceX does this really cool thing where they will launch stuff into space, like satellites, etc., and then the rocket boosters will fly back and land back on the landing pad so they can reuse them again. Which, when you look at it, it looks like something out of the future, but it's happening now, and they're learning how to do it now. They released a video of all the explosions they've had before they had success. And they put it to dramatic, like really patriotic music. And they would have little jokes about each explosion. And you just see the things just millions of dollars going up. And the point of the video, even though there's no words, the end, you see one of these rocket boosters land on the landing pad. You just realize this was the journey they went on. And they had to go there to get this incredible success. They had to have all these failures to learn from. It was really inspiring.
Yeah. I mean, obviously there's always a lot of controversy surrounding Elon Musk, sir. But I always found it just kind of funny how you would look at his reaction to those explosions and, him talking about like, wow, this was like an absolute smashing success. We were able to do X, Y, Z to get to the next level of R&D for our next rocket. And then you go to the New York Times or any sort of like media outlet, and it's like SpaceX failed rocket launch. And it's just a complete dichotomy of like, how are they viewing reality? And then it's just, it's a little bit funny to see, but yeah, I think it is 100%. It's like that, just having that growth mindset. And I think setting that expectation that like, hey, this is likely to go horribly in terms of like, things are going to explode into a million pieces, but in the end, we're going to be better from this.
Yeah, and when they do, how are you going to treat yourself and how are you going to treat your team as well if you're leading a team?
Exactly. Yeah. And I guess like maybe just quickly touching on that, Keith, like you mentioned, like those folks who do have that curious mindset and they're ultimately going to see their growth curve look like a hockey stick versus those folks who don't, maybe not. Maybe just giving a little bit of insight into like some of the differences that you've seen as people are growing over the years or not growing as much. Like, what are some of the big themes that you're seeing in that, I guess, relationship?
I'm not sure I understand your question.
So I guess like you put somebody at the age of 25 with a curious mindset and they're starting at, call it a Fortune 100 business or whatever it may be, and put them side by side with somebody who has more of that fixed mindset, not as curious, not as open to growth. What does that look like 15 years down the line? Like, what are the long-term implications of what that can be for you as a leader in an organization?
For the person who does have more of the growth mindset, who leans into failure, which means they're okay putting themselves out there and not being perfect, they'll continue to grow and evolve. And when they get into leadership, where your dinner time conversation, whatever you say, is going to be talked about. And if it doesn't go well, you just made dinner time conversation where, I don't know what the leader was thinking, it didn't go so well. They're going to be okay with that because they're going to give themselves grace and they realize, I'm getting better. I will evolve at whatever these skills are. And through their evolving, they're going to continue to grow, learn more and more skills a little bit quicker. And assuming they extend the same grace and acceptance of well-intentioned mistakes from others, their team will get inspired from their leader and also continue to grow as well. The opposite of the person who looks at failure and maybe they make a mistake, they get the looks from their leader or their peers of, this didn't go so well. They internalize it. They want to play small. They start avoiding taking risks, no matter how brilliant they are. They may have a lot of natural talent, but they may not be growing as quickly to that talent. And when they do have the inevitable bumps in a road that happen when you're learning, because when you're growing, the whole goal is to go to new places you've never been. And when you're going to new places you've never been, some people will judge themselves. I should know already how to be here. Why? But if they're judging themselves, they just don't grow as quick and they take in a lot of shame and a lot of really strong negativity towards themselves. And that negative self-talk can really start spiraling.
Yeah. And I think the reality is like, I think important for people to know. And I think something that I've encountered in my own life is like, I feel like I am on that growth path and try to have that growth mindset as much as I
Yeah.
can. I think it's important for people to know that it's inevitable to like be in a fixed mindset for at least certain periods of time. And I think the key is to recognize that and be able to step outside of that. Like, you're going to have those feelings of shame. You're going to have those feelings of doubt and failure and all of that sort of stuff. It's just about having that awareness and lack of judgment. So I think that's key in all of this. And I think something you talked about with the growth mindset and I guess comparing that leader, and ultimately we just see this ripple effect that these leaders are having on the organization. And that's kind of what you're touching on, is like, if they're able to have this growth mindset, then everybody they're managing is having that growth mindset, and it kind of just funnels through the organization. And then all of a sudden you're building a culture around it. So Keith, this has been great. I guess just to wrap it up, we always have HR leaders, people leaders, L&D leaders listening in on this. Always like them to be able to walk away with just a few practical tips that they can take back into their workplace. And in this case, what are a couple of nuggets or pieces of advice for those HR leaders who are looking to have a culture within their organization that embraces failure more effectively? I think the listeners would love to hear your input.
Great question. Innovation takes risk, which means it's going to take failure, which means you'll get to the greatness, but it's going to take a lot of iteration to get there. So one of the things that's helpful, I think, is to audit your culture to identify where are we with failure. If you don't allow any failure, you won't have folks striving for greatness, and instead they're just protecting themselves and trying not to get in trouble. Whereas if you tend to be more okay with it, you're going to get more greatness and more innovation. So what is the organizational capacity and tolerance for failure, and how do we learn from it? Are we learning from it as well? Number two, as an organization, what is punished and what's rewarded? Part of failure is taking in a steady diet of well-intentioned mistakes. That means at the individual level and at the organizational level.
Yeah.
Remember New Coke?
Of course.
Yeah, that didn't go so well for the Coca-Cola company. Many years after, when they rolled out New Coke, which is a new Coke formula, they did away with the old one. It was a huge disaster. It didn't work out well. They brought back the old formula and called it Coca-Cola Classic, and peace was restored. Many years later, they had a learning summit with this, with the CEO and the top leaders talking about, here's why we made the decisions we did, and here's what we learned from it. What a great way to learn and internalize just from that failure that they had. And to also show everyone, this is part of it, having a steady diet of these well-intentioned mistakes at the organizational level, including. Finally, third tip would be education here, and helping people either through coaching, through training. What is their relationship with it? Because at the individual level is where you can have some really substantive shifts.
Yeah. And that second to last one there around just having a postmortem around these sorts of experiments or decisions that we made that maybe didn't turn out the way we wanted it to, or even a prospect that we weren't able to close. Like, are we doing a full postmortem on all of this and making sure that we are learning everything we can from it? I think that's so huge, and is really, from what I've seen, a huge void in a lot of workplaces and societies, including our own. I think we can be doing a much better job with that today. So
yeah, it becomes almost punishing, and well, who made the mistake and where are they? And let's finger point at them collectively versus what we learn here.
Exactly. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Keith. And I think just lastly, where can the listeners connect with you and learn more about your work?
So I'm on the Boone Health platform here. I'm one of the coaches here, and I love to work with people on their relationship with failure. You can find me here in Boone Health. I'm on LinkedIn as well. I love to help folks strive to be themselves and walk side by side with them, be their change ally into greatness.
Awesome. Appreciate you, Keith. We'll talk soon.